Welcome, everybody. I'm Registered Dietitian Myrna Haag. This is the Myrna Method live stream. What we're going to talk about in this video is, well, it's that time of year. It's going to be about holiday triggers, the ones that really get you into that obsessive eating. And quite honestly, we don't sometimes think of it that way, obsessive eating, but it's really about a brain chemical entrapment, really, that gets us locked in to a overeating of all the foods we don't really want to do. And we're in a prime environment when it comes to the holiday. So what we're going to talk about in this video is the science behind that. And then, most importantly, how do we fix it? So, Sam, if you can just take us right into the PowerPoint and we'll get started. All right, so breaking the obsessive holiday trigger eating. Yeah, well, I guess we could say for any holiday, it doesn't have to be the Christmas holiday. And we always think about, free will, like just don't eat that. Honestly, free will, okay, I'll give it a little bit of credit, but it's not really about free will. We get locked into this addiction with food, and it's like free will goes out the door. So I want to talk about where that happens when it comes to addiction. Is it in the brain? Is it in the gut? How is this all happening? And most importantly, how do we stop it from happening? The brain sort of goes through a hijacking in a way. And it's all about this holiday food obsession. And when we think about the holiday food obsession, it really starts, I'd say about a week before Thanksgiving, maybe 2. It's a 2-month process. And it's this joyful, fun, pleasurable experience that we're anticipating. And this can lead to months of digression. In other words, all this anticipatory excitement about the holidays and what it does to our brain in regards to food and stimulus, well, let's just talk about it. First of all, it's a special occasion. So whenever you think of a special occasion, you already sort of conjure up all these expectations. When it comes to the holidays, it's all about food. We're thinking about Thanksgiving and the holidays, the cookies, the parties. Sure, it's about seeing the people, but behind that, the backdrop tends to be about the food. And then, of course, there's gift giving, and I mean gift giving from the standpoint of nutrients, foods. People bring pies and cakes, and it's never like a big salad, right? They're bringing the sugar and the fat because it's about the sugar and the fat and the pleasure that brings you, that your friends are bringing as gifts. And it's sort of like a happy cheer. It's going to be joyful. So why is sugar and fat so joyful? Is there really any chemical basis behind that? And there certainly is, to the extent that it can cause addiction that's really tough to turn off. So when we think about stimulus, unfortunately, the more overweight you become, the more receptive you are to the stimulus. So that kind of stinks, doesn't it? Because you're overweight, you're trying to lose weight, and it almost seems like the stimulus of food has a little more grip on you. So the science behind that is that it's all about fat and sugar. Now, you can't really just eliminate fat and sugar because really sugar can come in the form of carbohydrates in excess. But when you're looking at sugar, we're looking at the white stuff, right? The cakes and the cookies and how that affects all these other areas of the body. And also fat as well. So fat and sugar trigger this addiction. And what happens with that is that we have a chemical shift in the insulin and the gut bacteria and the brain chemicals. So when we think of fat and sugar, the science behind where this is all really coming down to is that insulin in the body does some things chemically that cause you to become more addicted to food. Also, we're going to see in the gut bacteria, certain bacterias, they can travel up to the brain and give us more of a stimulus for more food. And the same thing with the brain chemicals themselves. So when we look at fat and sugar, they have the ability to interact with these areas and actually cause this craving to want more fat and sugar. And then the outcome, unfortunately, is insulin resistance, which is really type 2 diabetes several years or maybe even a decade before. Then we get this hormone resistance, leptin, insulin. So we get certain hormones in our body that just don't work like they should. And then what happens is we get the fat gain. So a lot of this chemical shift that goes on in the holidays, it starts out with the brain thinking about the anticipatory food that's going to be happening. Just the stimulus alone starts to get your body worked up into getting into a chemical addiction. You haven't even eaten the food yet, but if you are overweight, just the stimulus, just the idea of knowing you're going into the holidays can trigger that. And also, I want to kind of go back to this because I have to mention gift giving when it comes to food. You know, they bring the pie, they bring the cakes, they bring the cookies, and it's like a whole plate of them. It's not like it's one or two. And it makes it super hard because you go through this guilt thing that you really don't want to throw it out because, you know, they went through a lot of effort and maybe it was an expensive pie. So it's not like you want to eat one piece and then just, you know, say, okay, it's not good for me, I'm going to put it in the trash. No, it sits in the refrigerator and it sits there and calls your name. And after all, you're in the holiday, the whole stimulus that's going on in the brain is actually getting you more excited about eating the very foods that 2 or 3 months after this, your body can have some outcomes that are not very desirable, like insulin resistance and some of the hormones that can be affected. So let's get into the science. We're going to start with insulin resistance. And I think this is a story I tell in almost every podcast, right? So here I go again. But we're going to talk about it in regards to hunger. What insulin resistance is, it's when the receptor site that insulin docks on becomes clogged up with excess fats and doesn't allow the transporter that lets the sugar into the muscle cell to get the message. So what happens is insulin attaches to the receptor site on the muscle cell, which talks to a messenger, talks to another messenger, and allows this transporter to the surface. But what can happen with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes is this insulin receptor site becomes clogged with too much fat, excess fatty acids from eating too much dietary fat, just too much doggone fat in your diet. Or maybe you have a lot of body fat, but either way, you're releasing these fatty acids that go into circulation and accumulate in non-fat tissue, which are muscle tissues. And when that happens, this fat changes to a certain type of fat called a ceramide. I've talked about this in other podcasts, how these ceramides can cause problems in other areas, contribute to neurodegenerative disease, cognitive decline, artery inflammation. But let's get back to addiction, because that's what we're here to talk about. So when you do have this insulin resistance and you do not have good entrance of the sugar into the cell, because what typically happens, the normal way it's supposed to go without insulin resistance, is as soon as insulin attaches to this receptor site, then this allows glucose into the cell. So we eat a carbohydrate, it breaks down to glucose in the bloodstream, and glucose runs to the muscle to get inside because muscles absolutely do want the sugar, so does the brain cells. But in order for that to happen, insulin must talk to that cell. So insulin then travels to the muscle cells or receptor sites, latches on, and this is what allows the transporter to the surface, and then sugar goes into the cell. And why do I mention this? Is because this is going to be really important when we look at hunger, even from the standpoint if you have insulin resistance and you're diabetic, because it creates more of a desire for sugar. Let's explain. So when insulin is released into the bloodstream when you're eating a lot of sugar, then this creates a chemical response. When you have more insulin, you have more sugar. When you have more sugar, you have more insulin. And this increases what I call insulin hunger. Now, it's not necessarily that you're really hungry from the standpoint that you really need nutrients. This is what happens when excess insulin is circulating in the bloodstream. It actually triggers a craving for more sugar. When this happens, when you have this insulin in the bloodstream that does this, and you're wanting to have more sugar, because that's what insulin will do, it triggers that desire, it then affects you in other areas, which we're going to talk about next. It affects brain chemicals and the reward center, so that you get into this big frenzy of wanting more sugar. So what can happen with diabetes type 2, or what can happen if you have insulin resistance? So insulin resistance, these receptor sites become clogged maybe a decade before you ever get diagnosed with full-blown type 2 diabetes. Insulin resistance is type 2 diabetes before it's diagnosed, and this causes the receptor site to not allow you become insulin resistant, to allow the sugar into the muscle cell. Now you have a situation when you have insulin resistance, and a lot of times you know you're getting insulin resistant when you start getting a lot of belly fat, because it's actually the fat in the belly that is really the first reflection of this. Because when the sugar can't get into the muscle, the sugar starts to go into the fat cells. And when the sugar goes into the fat cells, you become fatter in the midsection. So with insulin, the key here is that when it isn't working like it's supposed to, because it can't get the sugar into the muscle because the transporter is not getting the message, then you're going to get even more insulin in the blood. Because what happens is the sugar builds up in the blood, can't seem to get in the muscle, and the pancreas releases more insulin. This means you're going to get more of a trigger for hunger, and the type of thing that you're craving when you have excess insulin in the blood is more sugar. So this is a real problem, because what happens then is this can go into the brain and hit some of our reward centers. So let's jump right to the brain. We'll come back to the gut. So in the brain, we have receptor sites that actually respond to excess sugar, that create a chemical called dopamine. And this increase in sugar increases a chemical in the brain called dopamine, which then sits on certain receptor sites that are in our reward center. And this creates this constant feedback loop where the brain actually, maybe insulin started the bandwagon because you wanted more sugar because you had all this insulin in the blood. Well, then the brain takes over and it actually creates its own addiction. It's kind of like a feedback loop. It not only does it with dopamine, but it does it with fat as well, because we have receptor sites in the brain. Ghrelin is a hormone that's made in the stomach when you get hungry, and it increases your desire for more fat. And then you start the cycle of having more fat, which increases the desire for more fat because it hits these receptor sites. And this really turns on the food addiction in the brain. So we've got this thing going on in the brain. We have this thing going on in the bloodstream with the sugar and the insulin. So this is why we can get this full-blown feeling of out of control, that we just feel like we started with one piece of pie and we're rolling into the second or third helping, or maybe it's a little scoop of ice cream that turns into a big bowl. And it's not like you want to eat it, right? It's not like you're sitting here going, I don't want to eat all this food. I don't even want to eat 3 or 4 cookies. Well, when you start getting these hormones really doing these feedback loops, then you start getting in big trouble. So there's a lot of places that addiction sort of starts to trigger and fester. And with the brain chemicals, when you start dipping into these receptor sites and your body starts demanding more fat and more sugar, what can happen there, especially with dopamine, and sugar's what triggers this dopamine, is as the dopamine clicks into these receptor sites, and the receptor sites are very receptive to this dopamine, sugar driving that bus, what happens is when you recover, you're going to drop below the baseline. Now, dopamine and serotonin, these are all kind of mood enhancers, and you literally drop below the body's line of what it normally would like to keep for dopamine levels. Now, what that does is it means for you to hit this high again, you have to eat a lot more sugar to bring it all the way up. Now, your body wants to reach this high because each time you do it, you drop it even below the baseline of what I I would say where the mood is stable, and you get into this sort of state of depression. So a lot of this excess sugar, like I said, could start with insulin surging because you were just eating too much sugar. Maybe you're a diabetic, type 2 diabetic. They shouldn't have sugar, but talk to a type 2 diabetic and it seems to be that's all they want, right? They have cravings for sugar. Also, this can create this depression because each time you get this load of sugar in the brain to hit these reward centers, then it makes you need even more the next time. Because if you look at this line to this line, that's a heck of a lot more sugar to trigger that dopamine response than this one over here. So as you get into this addiction of fat and sugar, it sort of takes a role of its own. It's sort of like a runaway train. This is what's going on in the brain, which is a feedback loop that can happen from what's going on in the bloodstream. So when we eat a lot of sugar, it goes into the bloodstream. The body releases, or the pancreas releases the insulin to get to the muscles to be able to allow that sugar into the muscle cell. And everything typically works fine. So even if you don't have insulin resistance and you have a lot of sugar in the blood, you're going to have a lot of insulin as well. But if you have type 2 diabetes, it's a double whammy because it means you're going to get even more insulin in the blood and you're going to get even hungrier and more of a demand for sugar. And while this is going on in the bloodstream, then what goes on in the brain is the feedback loop where the brain just continually wants to have that pleasure center because these dopamine centers, these receptor sites that I'm referring to for the fat and for the sugar, trigger a feedback of continuing to want more. Because they are literally up in a reward center that's saying, oh my gosh, this is great, feels great. And why would the body do this, right? Because it doesn't make sense. Why would fat and sugar be such a trigger to want to eat more? Fall into this addiction state where you're not even able to control it from an appetite standpoint. Because the body does have regulatory systems for the appetite, which is what I'm going to talk about next, because if you can hit on those, you're not going to hit on the addiction center. And that's the main point. If we can stay out of food addiction, trust me when I'll say this, you will lose most of your weight. Because it's usually this compulsive nature of wanting to eat more that makes us really gain the weight. Not necessarily that everybody, no, I've never met anybody that says, yeah, I gained 20 pounds this year, can't wait to gain 20 more next year. Not happening. So when we look at why the body would do this, it goes back to the days of the caveman days, or maybe not even that far back, but we were designed to have receptor sites in our brain that would create this pleasure of eating. Because in the wild, when the fruit was the ripest, when the plants we were eating were the ripest, they were the best for us, right? Because nature had put all the ingredients at the highest level, they were the ripest. And then what the plant did, it turned on the sugar switch. So that plant became actually more sweet. And that is a beautiful thing because in our brain, it triggered eat, eat, eat until you're so fat you can't eat anymore because 2 weeks later, the fruit would have been rotten. Winter is coming. We got to get you to eat the entire field of sugar. And so it was the body's way of saying, we're going to shut off the regulatory system, the one that I want to show you how to turn on, so you're not turning on this one. The body says, let's turn off the regulatory system for appetite, the one that would keep you lean, and let's turn on the one that will get you fat because we got to eat all the fruit before the snow comes, right? Before the winter arrives. And if you catch an animal and it's juicy and it's fat and you've got it on the skewer, and good for you because the tribe's so happy you caught whatever buffalo, deer, but bottom line, there's no refrigeration. And that fat also triggers that desire to want to overeat. So fat and sugar have its beautiful place in the environment because it was actually designed to help us to survive because we would eat beyond the regulatory system that would have turned it off. Now, put that in today's environment and you're in a heap load of trouble. Because you put food with a lot of sugar and fat, you're going to hit these reward centers that tell you to keep eating because it feels good. And when you're looking at the holiday, what can really make it worse is that you have this anticipatory state of stimulus, that you're actually stimulated with the fact that the holidays are coming. And just being stimulated can form a certain state of excitement where the receptor sites get worked up and ready for this food because you're really thinking about it. And when we think about the holidays, my point being, it seems to be so much around food, right? We think about Thanksgiving and Christmas. Sure, we want to see the folks, but we know there's going to be parties, there's going to be food, there's going to be a lot of fat and sugar food because they want to make you feel good. And friends come over, they're not going to bring you a big salad. They're going to bring you those cookies, that pie, that food that you know is going to make you feel so good eating it. But it can cause a lot of problems even months after. And that's why, everybody, I guess, the first of the year starts their New Year's resolutions. But even then, some of the damage you do during the holidays can really have some lasting effects. So when I think about obesity and I think about some of the reward centers, and it can actually even affect our cognitive decline in our brains. And this is really leads to some metabolic issues. But the whole thing in this study that I wanted to talk about was this hedonic eating, which means pleasure eating, is thought to be derived from this reward center, this food consumption. And this is the whole thing I was referring to in the brain. And it really sits on the fact that the body's trying to get you to overeat, thinking that it has to do that for survival. And this is what really creates this almost uncontrollable way of eating that is tough to turn off. And a lot of studies show that with obesity, the individuals kind of learn, they develop this neuroplasticity in the brain that immediately gets turned on. It's like a hyper activation in response to just food stimulus. So also with obesity, we can change some of the hormones, leptin and insulin. We can become insulin resistant. When I go back to the example here and I talk about type 2 diabetes and I'm talking about insulin resistance, I'm talking about these receptor sites in the muscle cells, and it also can happen in the brain cells because brain cells also have insulin receptor sites. These things become disabled. This is insulin resistance because the muscle is resistant to insulin. It cannot get the message to the transporter to allow it to the surface to let the sugar in. So let's say you're getting a little muffin top. You're getting a little extra around the belly, which most of us do as we age because we don't know how to eat. Well, this can trigger a situation that you don't even have to eat a lot of carbs. You get more sugar in the blood and you seem to get hungrier. So when we look at addiction and we look that it can happen in several places, there's one more place I want to talk about. Like that isn't bad enough, right? I want to talk about the gut. Because when we look at the chemical shift that goes on with the insulin and the brain chemicals that trigger in this feedback loop, we also have another feedback loop with the gut. And how this works is when you are with a lot of foods that are not fiber foods, that are not plant foods, or even a diet that's maybe just too high in fat, this can increase the bad gut bacteria. And these bad gut bacteria travel up through the brainstem and actually create a craving for more fat and sugar. So these bacteria live off of fat and sugar. This is what helps them survive in the gut. So obviously they want to tell the appetite center in the brain to have a palate for more fat and sugar. And I think when I'm thinking of the gut and I'm thinking about how it manipulates the brain, it's really about a palate for foods this is what I see. I see it a lot with my patients. When I can tell that they have a lot of gut dysbiosis, they tend to have issues. They're picky eaters. They don't like vegetables because they're not used to eating vegetables, and their brain develops a palate to not eat these things. So is it really that they just don't want to eat them, or is there something chemically going on? Well, science shows there's actually something chemically going on with the gut and the foods that we're eating. So a lot of these plant foods, and I know I've talked about this before, and I'm just going to show you the study since I'm on it, eating behavior manipulated by the gastrointestinal microbiota, which is these gut bacteria. And it talks about here how they travel up through the vagus nerve, and they can actually cause a manipulation of the neurotransmitters, of the chemicals in your brain, to where you begin to want to overeat. It can actually cause you to want to eat more foods that keep these bacteria alive. So when we look at the gut in particular, and we're looking at some of the things that are produced in the gut, they're of really great value. Two things that I talk about a lot in my podcast are short-chain fatty acids. These are chemicals that are made from plant foods, and also good bacteria. So by eating fiber foods, coming from vegetables, coming from fruits, grains, vegetables, grains, all the plant foods, not adding the fat into it, because that can create a shield. So when you have a gut that has a lot of high fat in it, it actually protects the bad bacteria from being destroyed by the good, because the good guys are always trying to keep that balance. So if we're eating a diet that's high in fiber, we can actually produce better good bacteria, not have the bad guys going up to the brainstem and telling the brain, hey, deliver this food that keeps that gut not in such good shape. So when we think about the three things that really cause food addiction, it has to do with insulin, it has to do with the gut bacteria, and also the brain chemicals. So when we get these things off center, what happens, I need to turn that off. When we get these things off center, then we're going to have some hormone issues, fat gain, and insulin resistance / type 2 diabetes. So how do we fix it? So the best way to fix this would be to, number one, don't show up hungry. When you're looking at the holidays, you know you're going to these parties, and it's opposite of what you think, because there's going to be a lot of sugar, a lot of fat there, bacon, rolled, whatever, scallops, or I'm just making that up. I don't know, bacon, whatever, sugary, sweets. There's going to be things that are going to be loaded in fat, cheesy things. And this is going to create a problem because you're already going there hungry. And when you go there hungry, especially with fat, you create a hormone in your stomach called ghrelin. Let's bring that slide up. And this triggers a desire for more fat. So when you're hungry, the stomach creates a hormone in response to that, which then triggers chemicals in your brain, these receptor sites, to become hot and heavy over fat. So it's almost like you desire more fat because it will satisfy you according to the brain. So we don't really want to show up to a holiday event super hungry. Now, a lot of times people will say, well, I'm going to save my appetite so I can go to the party and really enjoy the food. Well, be careful with what you wish for, because that'll lock you into eating the very foods, seconds and thirds, that probably may not be a good idea. So what I would suggest is that you pre-snack on protein and fiber. The two things that turn off the switch, let me just state this. The two things that really turn off the switch when you're looking at your appetite and you're looking at affecting that hypothalamus is protein and fiber. Those are the two foods that I really recommend when I'm working with patients. Not just protein and fiber. We have to bring some carbs in, but we're going to bring them in with a lot of fiber. But protein and fiber in general can actually create a decrease in a lot of these hits that are causing the fat and sugar to create this reward center. So what we want to try to do is maybe eat a little snack of protein and fiber. Don't add a lot of fat to it, right? And this could be enough to dull down that appetite so we're not craving those fatty foods. And then the other thing is, and this is just an obvious one, we don't want to eat a lot of excess fat and sugar at one time. So when we're looking at going for that whatever favorite little dessert you love, you want to make sure that before you go for that, you want to have a meal that has some protein, high fiber carbs, some vegetables. You want to go for a meal that has that protein and fiber. It's almost like you want to coat the gut. You want to have all that good food in there already so that the body doesn't see a lot of this excess fat and sugar in the bloodstream creating all these reactions. So if you're going to have a little treat, don't do it in the middle of the day. Don't do it on an empty stomach. Do it after the meal that you've been able to have the protein and a lot of this fiber. Do it in a meal that you're able to have the foods that will help balance out that sugar, is basically what I'm saying. So when we're looking at breaking the holiday addiction, once you're in the addiction, it's really tough. That's a runaway train. But the key is trying to set yourself up so that you're not in a place where the foods become so desirable it's tough to stop. So you want to make sure that you get your body in a position that it's working from the regulatory system, the appetite regulatory system that's really from the neck down. Bringing in the plants, bringing in the proteins. So the body's not going to be triggering it, because if you do that, let's go back to the insulin example, just to give this to you from a science standpoint. If I'm eating foods that have protein and fiber with the carbohydrates, I am not going to have an excess of sugar going into the bloodstream. And why is that? Because when you eat a carbohydrate and there's no fiber and there's no protein, there's nothing to slow that down, that carbohydrate will go into the bloodstream super fast, because that's what carbs do. They break down fast and they go into the bloodstream fast. So that means whatever carbohydrate you're eating is going to all end up in the bloodstream in probably a matter of like 5 minutes, depending on if there's nothing to slow it down. Not the case with protein. Protein can take 2 or 3 hours to hit the bloodstream, and fiber never leaves the gut. So imagine all these carbohydrates tied up in the gut with a lot of protein and fiber. We're not going to have a situation where you're going to get a ton of insulin, because those carbs are going to have a trickle effect. They're just going to come out in a more time-release fashion, which is good, because you're going to have this slower response because you took protein and fiber, you slowed down the carbs. There's going to be less insulin hunger because you're not going to have a lot of insulin. Probably less issues with insulin resistance because it's not like all of these are clogged. So when you do it in a slower fashion, you're going to have a better outcome. Now, a lot of people say, well, why eat carbs at all? Because muscles do crave carbs. And you have to know that if you do a low-carb diet, you're going to be a carb addict. And I can really talk about this. I have talked about it in other podcasts. But you got to understand that these macronutrients, they have a purpose. The key with this video was to show how food addiction can cause a lot of these imbalances. And the way to bring it back and reel it in is to eat a diet that's going to be a lot of fiber, protein. And I wanted to kind of give you an example. I have a plant-based plate here. And I do that because a lot of people think a plant-based plate is going to just be a lot of carbs, not very good for me. But the key here is that I'm bringing in the fiber. So I have half the plate of vegetables, and then I have some farro, and farro is even better than brown rice, because for farro, for half a cup, you have 7 grams of protein, and you've got 5 grams of fiber. And I do that with a cup of beans. So just between the farro and the beans, I have 20 grams of fiber right there. And so I'm giving a proportion to show you, because the proportion is half your plate, you got all these vegetables. And then almost 3/4, or maybe I would say a little more than a quarter, you have high fiber carbs. And then this is where the protein is. Because the protein is important, it helps balance. But a lot of these carbohydrates, if you are eating the carbohydrates from a high fiber source, okay, you're going to balance the muscle, make it happy. It's not going to demand the sugar. That's another addiction. Not really tied into eating a lot of fat and sugar, but the key is that you're bringing in a diet, that you're eating, that you're bringing in food so that your body's not going to be craving these fats and sugars. So I hope this helped. The whole deal with obesity is it does create this hijack phenomenon because you do get more hormones that become imbalanced. The best way around it is really not to diet. I don't advocate dieting because it creates more imbalances. And if you don't know how to do it and you don't do it correctly, you may lose the weight, but then you get the rebound and you gain it all back. So the key is to understand how the macronutrients work, how you bring in the protein, fiber, carbs, and fat in a balanced portion so that the body doesn't trigger these addictions that can happen. Because like I said, if we're working on the 3 areas, the insulin being off, because we know if we bring the protein and fiber, we're going to slow that down. The gut bacteria, because we know the plant foods that you're eating on that plate is going to really create a balancing effect from these bad to good bacteria. And the brain chemicals don't get triggered because the fat and sugar is not in this excessive amount. So I wanted to leave it open on the chat in case anybody had questions. And Sam, if you want to switch it over.
All right, let me just see. Hold on a second. I do think.
Nope. Looking good.
Hold on. We just have a happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And this whole month, I'm going to talk about food during the holidays. So next week, I'll give you some tips also.
You've also hit a 500.
Oh, yes. We're actually, I think, almost at 550, which thank you so much. I love serving you. This is my passion. Hopefully, it's impactful for you. Let me know. Tell me what you think. Until next time.